off of provincial assets, including land, joint stocks, and motor vehicle registries to a private for-profit corporation is of grave importance. Does the House agree to give leave for the motion to be debated? As I've heard several noes, I've asked those who support the motion to rise in their place pursuant to Rule 43-7. As more than 10 members have risen, the member has the leave under Rule 43-8, and this debate will take place today at the moment of adjournment as provided under Rule 43-11. We'll now move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. We now know that the Premier's Chief of Staff met with the member for Dartmouth East on February 12th. It certainly appears that the meeting was arranged so the Premier's Chief of Staff could offer a return to Cabinet at a future date to the member. In fact, he said, and I quote, "There is a path back for you," and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is pretty simple. Did the Premier ask his Chief of Staff to have that meeting?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times in this House, in late December, Mr. Younger was a victim of an assault. He had a number of death threats on him. Mr. Speaker, he had communicated to my office that he had health issues, and to other members of this House that he had health issues. We advised him, Mr. Speaker, it would be in his best interest to take a leave from that, or otherwise we would provide him with that leave. At that time, I notified Mr. Younger that when he felt his health was back to where it should be, he would let me know, and that I would put him back, as every other member of this caucus, in the queue when it comes to being brought into the Executive Council when I make a decision to do so. Mr. Speaker, a few months ago, I made changes in the Executive Council, and Mr. Younger was brought back in.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but it certainly appears that the meeting was not for the purpose of discussing Mr. Younger's health at all. It was to discuss what conditions would be placed on his return to Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, the Chief of Staff to the Premier is quoted as saying at that meeting, "The Premier wants the legal stuff dealt with," and I will table that quote as well. So my question to the Premier, and hopefully we'll get a direct answer, is what instructions did the Premier offer to his Chief of Staff regarding the meeting with the member for Dartmouth East on that day?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I again want to go back to walk the Honourable Member through the process. In early December, Mr. Speaker, as you know, Mr. Younger was a victim of an assault. We had a number of death threats. We had security on Mr. Younger around this House. He spoke to us about health issues. We advised him he should take a break, or we would provide him one. He chose to take a break. Mr. Speaker, at that time I said to him, when your health has been restored and you feel that you're able to come back, notify me, we'll bring you back in the queue. Mr. Speaker, he was brought back into Cabinet long before the proceedings before the court had been dealt with, Mr. Speaker. It is in no way, at any time, would I ever, in the wildest dreams, think about involving myself in any criminal matter or anyone else's personal matters, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, in no way has it been indicated that that meeting involved a discussion about the member's health. I wish it had, Mr. Speaker. We all would. But the fact of the matter is that the meeting was about what the member would have to do in order to get invited back to Cabinet, something that is purely in the prerogative of the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Chief of Staff met with the member for Dartmouth East that day. He offered him, a direct quote, a path back to Cabinet when the legal stuff was dealt with. Well, ask the Premier, was he briefed on the outcome of that meeting?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member is quoting a small portion of a taped conversation that has gaps in the middle of the tape that always provided out. The conversation was about 20 minutes. We have about a 2-minute conversation that has gaps in the middle of it, and the Honourable Member is quoting from it. Let's bear in mind why we're at this point today, Mr. Speaker. There was a criminal case that the honourable member from Dartmouth East used a rule in this House that 90% of the people sitting in here had no idea even existed. And then, Mr. Speaker, he went and misrepresented the advice he received from the clerk of this House. And he communicated that misrepresentation to me. Upon finding that out, Mr. Speaker, I informed Mr. Younger at no time in the future will he be a member of this Executive Council or a member of this caucus. I have to have the confidence, Mr. Speaker, when what they're telling me is telling me the truth. If he wants to rely on a broken 2-minute conversation that was taped, Mr. Speaker, I'll leave it up to him to do that.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last evening, CBC aired an audio recording of the Premier's Chief of Staff telling the member from Dartmouth East what the Premier expected of him if he wanted to return to Cabinet. According to CBC, the conversation in question was captured on the 12th of February at the member's constituency office. So my question for the Premier is this. When was he first informed about this meeting between his Chief of Staff, Kirby McVicker, and the member from Dartmouth East?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. My Chief of Staff meets with many members of the Executive Council and caucus on a regular basis. I am not informed of all of those meetings, Mr. Speaker, but I want to again reassure this House that in December, Mr. Younger was a victim of an assault. A number of death threats, Mr. Speaker, had come to his office. He had communicated through to us he had health issues. We had told him he should take a break, or we would provide him with one. He chose to take a break. At that time, I informed him if he health came back to good spirits, Mr. Speaker, come back. I would put him in the queue with every other member of this caucus when we were going to change the executive branch of government, and that's exactly what I did.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I didn't hear an answer to my question of whether or not the Premier was aware that this meeting was taking place, had taken place on the 12th of February. So I'll try again, Mr. Speaker. Last night, the tape that was aired called into question the involvement of the Premier's office in the matter between the member for Dartmouth East and a legal process, a conversation in which the Premier's Chief of Staff talked about a criminal matter that they wanted to go away. The best option being that it be tossed, Mr. Speaker. So my question again to the Premier is, what did his Chief of Staff relate to him about what was discussed in the meeting between himself and the member from Dartmouth East on the 12th of February?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to remind all members of this House that the Leader of the New Democratic Party is referring to a portion of a tape that Mr. Younger did in a conversation between him and my Chief of Staff. He's released a portion of that conversation. It is completely out of context, Mr. Speaker, I would say. I think it's important that if Mr. Younger has the remaining parts of that tape, that he communicates it to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you what I have told him in December, if his health returned, to let me know. I would put him in the queue. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to inform all members of the House that's exactly what he did. And when I changed the Executive Council, he became a member of the Executive Council while that court case was still before the court, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not asking the Premier about the tape. I'm asking about the meeting. This is the Premier's opportunity to put those 2+ minutes into the context that he's talking about here. I merely am asking the Premier what briefing he received on what was discussed in the meeting between his Chief of Staff and the member from Dartmouth North, from which we know that at least some portion was spent discussing the impending trial. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to tell all members of this House the member from Dartmouth East in December was a victim of an assault. He had a number of death threats, had security, Mr. Speaker, following this building. He had communicated to us. He had a number of health issues. As any reasonable employer, Mr. Speaker, we informed Mr. Young, the member from Dartmouth East, that he either take a break or we provide him with one. He he decided to take that break, at which point, Mr. Speaker, I communicated to him that when his health returns to let me know to come back, that he was prepared to come back into the Executive Council, and when there were changes in the Executive Council, I would consider him like all other members of this caucus, which I did, Mr. Speaker, and I put him back before into the Executive Council, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know the Premier's Chief of Staff met with the member for Dartmouth East on February 12th. During the meeting, he discussed conditions upon which that member would be invited back to the Premier's Cabinet. In fact, the Chief of Staff said, and I quote in full, "There is a path back for you, and there are a couple of things that are on that path." Just ask the Premier very directly. Did he ask his Chief of Staff to offer a Cabinet position to the member for Dartmouth East with conditions, yes or no?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've communicated in and outside of this House that in December, when Mr. Younger was the victim of assault, had a number of death threats. The member from Dartmouth East had a number of assaults, Mr. Speaker. He communicated to us about health issues. I told him at that time, Mr. Speaker, that when his health returned to inform me, and I would put him in the queue about becoming part of the Executive Council. The only condition, Mr. Speaker, was that his health came back. Any reasonable employer in any part of this province, I believe, has a duty to ensure those that they're providing responsibility with have good health.
Just want to remind the Premier not to refer to the Honourable Member by his proper name. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I think we all wish that was the condition that was imposed that day, but it wasn't. Fact of the matter is, the Premier's Chief of Staff went to see the member for Dartmouth East, and he did impose a condition. And this is what he said, and I quote, "The first one is this: the end comes to the legal situation that has arisen." Why did the Chief of Staff impose that condition on the member for Dartmouth East?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the Honourable Member has been for the last number of months, Mr. Speaker. If that was a condition, why was he back in the Executive Council? Because the court case was still ongoing. Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Honourable Member he is taking a very small piece of a conversation. By the way, the piece of the conversation that the Honourable Member from Dartmouth East wants him to have. That's the same member, Mr. Speaker, who used an obscure rule in this House that over 90% of the people in this House had no idea it even exists, and, by the way, Mr. Speaker, misrepresented the clerk's advice, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier told this House that no one in his office had spoken to the member of Dartmouth East about his duty to give testimony. Yet a recording recently released by CBC shows us that the Premier's Chief of Staff did in fact speak to the member about his court case. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, when did the Chief of Staff tell the Premier of the contents of the discussion between himself and the member from Dartmouth East on February the 12th?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I again want to remind all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, in December, the member from Dartmouth East was a victim of an assault. He had a number of death threats, Mr. Speaker. He communicated to us that he also had health issues. We informed him that he needed to take a break, or we were going to provide one with him. He took that break, Mr. Speaker, at which time I said to him, when his health returned, to let me know, and we would put him in the queue, and at any time we were going to shuffle the Cabinet, Mr. Speaker. That's it.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not getting many answers to the questions, very direct questions. Mr. Speaker, the Premier acknowledged yesterday that his Chief of Staff was informed the night before the trial involving the member of Dartmouth East that he was going to raise his privilege as a way to shield himself from giving testimony. So I want to ask the Premier, why was it that the Premier's Chief of Staff did not pass that information along until the next day after the case had been tossed?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She's very right, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Young, the member from Dartmouth East, the minister called, laid out a number of issues that were in his department. At the end of it, said he was going to use privilege. Mr. Speaker, my chief of staff, like 90% of the members in this House, had no idea what the honourable member was referring to, other than the fact he was going to use his privilege as a victim, Mr. Speaker, and not show up to court. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, when the issue was raised at the House, not when it was tossed, Mr. Speaker, but when the issue was raised in the courtroom, is when I became informed of it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, that's a very interesting answer, Mr. Speaker, because at that meeting on February 12th, the Premier's Chief of Staff, talking about the assault trial, said very specifically, and I'll quote, "Hopefully that doesn't go, you know, it gets tossed, and that's the anticipation. It's great." Well, it's not great, Mr. Speaker, but the Premier maintains they had no idea that the member for Dartmouth East was going to use a loophole to get out of doing his duty at that assault trial that day. How can that be the case, Mr. Speaker? Why then did the Premier's office and his Chief of Staff anticipate, in their own words, that the trial would be tossed?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what had happened, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Dartmouth East had received advice from the clerk, Mr. Speaker. That advice was to tell him that privilege is often waived when it comes to criminal cases. That was not the way that advice was communicated through to us, nor, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, by his lawyer to the court. Contrary to that, Mr. Speaker, when that information was brought to my attention, we called the member from Dartmouth East, tell us how are these two things not lining up. The member from Dartmouth East, again, we asked him then to revoke his client solicitor privilege with the clerk of this House, which he did. They forwarded us an email which very contradicted the information that he provided us the previous day, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, I exercised what I believe is my duty and responsibility to remove anyone from the Executive Council in our caucus who is not willing to be forthright and tell me the truth to the best of their ability.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, that's also very interesting, Mr. Speaker, but something doesn't line up, because the Premier's Chief of Staff knew, at least as early as February 12th, that the trial was anticipated to be tossed. And, matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the member for Dartmouth East says very clearly that even before the charges were laid or an arrest was made, that Mr. McVicker, the Chief of Staff, had detailed information about the assault and the investigation. The Premier says they didn't know any of this until the last minute, but, Mr. Speaker, that alleged assault occurred over 2 years ago. When did the Premier first become aware that the trial was anticipated to be tossed by his office, and why didn't he act then?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we had never anticipated anything related to this trial, Mr. Speaker. It was before the court, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind the honourable member that the member from Dartmouth East was the victim in the assault, Mr. Speaker, when it was going to the court. Why we're here is the honourable member used a parliamentary privilege that 90% of this House had no idea even existed, Mr. Speaker, went against the advice of the clerk of the House when it came to criminal cases and exercised that right and informed us, Mr. Speaker, that he received the exact opposite advice. When I got clarity on that, Mr. Speaker, I did what I believe Nova Scotians expected me to do, and that was remove the honourable member from the Executive Council and from our caucus.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when the Premier was asked to comment on this very issue in the media yesterday, he said that the member for Dartmouth East's version, that they had known all along, it simply doesn't hold water. Why would I become involved in a criminal matter is the question that the Premier asked yesterday and again today. But his Chief of Staff says to the member for Dartmouth East months ago the Premier wants the legal stuff dealt with. Now, which version is true? The Premier's version, that he didn't, or his Chief of Staff's version, that he did?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I again want to remind the honourable member that he's using a portion of a conversation that has been provided to him by Mr. Young, by the member from Dartmouth East, who's the same member, quite frankly, who used the privilege, Mr. Speaker, to get away from a criminal case, who's the same member who misrepresented, quite frankly, what the clerk of this House provided him the information, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, my only advice to anyone in Nova Scotia charged in a criminal case is to show up to court.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Dartmouth East will answer to his recording, but the Premier has to answer questions in this House. That's why we're here today. By the way, he seems to know a lot about the recording. He knows it's 20 minutes long. That's news to all of us, Mr. Speaker, who are relying on the public accounts of what was said. But let's just be clear, Mr. Speaker, regardless of the length of the recording, the Premier's Chief of Staff says very clearly and completely the Premier wants the legal stuff dealt with. I'll just ask the Premier a simple yes or no question. Did he tell his Chief of Staff that he wants the legal stuff dealt with?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would tell all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, when they're called before the courts in this province, show up.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this. Why is he unwilling to tell this House what he knew about what was discussed at the meeting of February the 12th between his Chief of Staff and the member from Dartmouth East?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've told members of this House and members of the province, the media outside, Mr. Speaker, all that I knew associated with this case, Mr. Speaker. I'll continue to do so, provide the information to the best of my ability to the people of this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has repeatedly said that 90% of the members of this chamber didn't know what privilege meant. But, Mr. Speaker, that means that 10% did know what privilege meant, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I find it very hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, that any member who's been in this House for 12 and a half years had no knowledge or no appreciation of what privilege meant and how it had been used with respect to court cases in the past. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, how can he say that no one in his office, that none of the legal advisors around him had any knowledge of what privilege actually meant?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the honourable member, it wasn't members of my caucus that were before the courts in the most recent history of this province, Mr. Speaker. How would I know about privilege? You want to know what I? You want to know? You want to know what I believe privilege is, Mr. Speaker, is being given the right to represent the people of your community, to stand in this House, defend those interests, and provide the people of this province with a government that responds to the needs of our communities, Mr. Speaker. And I will continue, Mr. Speaker, to work with Nova Scotians to move this province forward.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. As we know, in recent years and past governments, there was a plan put in place to close, to review, and some schools were actually closed. One in my area that was closed was Newport Station District Elementary School, which closed in June of 2015. And I would just like to ask the Minister how that building or that facility will be divested of, or if it will, and what the process is, as there may be interest in that facility.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member. As the Education Act states, we have a process in place where schools, once they are no longer used for public education purposes, are divested. If they're pre-1982 building, they go back to the municipality. And we have had a number of schools that have done that. When they've become vacant, they've gone back to the municipality. The school in question, Newport Station School, did close in June. It's my understanding that that has reverted back to the municipality as it's no longer required for public education.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister, and I guess I'll take it up with the municipality. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, you know what? It is a privilege to serve in this House. That is the proper use of the word privilege. And the way that we show that privilege is by answering questions and being held accountable for what we do and what our senior staff does. Mr. Speaker, the Premier a moment ago disclosed that he knows, in fact, it was a 20-minute conversation that his Chief of Staff had with the member for Dartmouth East. That's news to all of us. Mr. Speaker, clearly the Premier was briefed on this conversation and the fact that it was 20 minutes long. So I'd like to ask him a simple question. What happened in the other 18 minutes?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Younger provided. The member from Dartmouth East. Clerk, I keep seeing you movement of your head. I know I'm making a mistake by referring to names. The member from Dartmouth East provided that recording to the media yesterday. My chief of staff said this was part of a 20-minute conversation that it's completely out of context, cuts, Mr. Speaker, even the tape that's been received by the media has gaps in it, Mr. Speaker. So all we're saying is, if you have the rest of the conversation, let's put it in context.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
All right, Mr. Speaker, I think that's a good idea. Let's put it in context. What we do know is that the Premier's Chief of Staff had a meeting with the member for Dartmouth East, said there's a path forward to him to come back to Cabinet, but the first thing he has to do is make the trial go away. That is basically what the conversation was about, Mr. Speaker. Premier says he doesn't know anything about this. Well, I'll ask the Premier a simple question. When the Premier's Chief of Staff goes to a member of the government side and gives him conditions on what he needs to do in order to come back into his Cabinet, does the Premier still have confidence in his Chief of Staff when he takes those actions?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the assertion by the member opposite is just completely inaccurate and false, Mr. Speaker. I communicated many times to the member from Dartmouth East that he needed to take a break in December. If that break, I would say to him, when your health returns, let me know. I will put you in the queue, Mr. Speaker. I want to remind all members of this House. I want to remind all members of the House. The member of Dartmouth East was brought back into the Executive Council long before this was dealt with in the courts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, you know, when the member for Dartmouth East was dismissed as a minister, the Premier got his own Chief of Staff to deliver the message. And when asked about that, the Premier said, and I quote, "Everyone knows when my Chief of Staff or those close to me speak, they speak on my behalf." My question to the Premier, who was ultimately responsible for that meeting, the Premier or his Chief of Staff?
The Honourable Premier.
Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I think what I said, Mr. Speaker, when I was asked by, I believe it was a reporter from CTV that night, my Chief of Staff made the call because I was at a Remembrance Day service at Camp Hills Hospital, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Premier's Chief of Staff met with the member for Dartmouth East on February 12th. The meeting was arranged clearly so the Chief of Staff could show a path back to Cabinet for that member if he met certain conditions. The first one, by his own words, was to have the trial dismissed, Mr. Speaker, to make it go away. So I'll ask the Premier, we know about this meeting. What other meetings are there, Mr. Speaker? Did the Premier, his Chief of Staff, or any officials from his office have any discussions with the other side of that trial, with Ms. Galt or her lawyer, regarding the trial or any other matters?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, members of my team had no involvement at all in this criminal case, Mr. Speaker. I want to again remind this House, the honourable member is making an assertion which is absolutely false. I want to remind all members of this House, the member from Dartmouth East took a leave of absence in December. At that point, I referred to when he returned to good health to let us know, Mr. Speaker. When he let me know, I put him in the queue with all other members of the caucus when we're making changes to the Executive Council. He was brought back in, Mr. Speaker, long before the criminal case had been dealt with. Under the honourable member's assertion, it absolutely proves how inaccurate his statement is.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are so many questions and there aren't very many answers, Mr. The Premier wants to communicate is that there was no involvement whatsoever from his office in the criminal case. But, Mr. Speaker, what I want to ask the Premier, was there ever any attempt by his office to determine what actually occurred on the night of October the 13th when the incident at the Dingle occurred?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it was before the courts. Is the honourable member suggesting she would interfere with a criminal case before the courts? It's absolutely ridiculous, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let me say very clearly to the Premier, if I was Premier and a member of my Cabinet, on the night that the cabinet was sworn in, was involved with a young person who had been serving as a staff member in my office, and criminal charges arose from some unknown circumstances. You're bloody right, I would want to know what occurred, and I would want to know that, to know whether or not that individual was worthy of being a member of my cabinet. So I want to ask the Premier, why on earth was the issue of whether or not this individual was appropriate to be in cabinet examined by his office?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind all members of the House when this issue came forward, what took place was to look at the reporting structure in the caucus office, Mr. Speaker. At no time, Mr. Speaker, did any one of my staff look at what was the assault. I want to remind the honourable member at that moment in time, the member of this House she's referring to was the victim. Is she suggesting that all victims, Mr. Speaker, should be penalised?
Just before we move on to the next question, I want to remind the House that the term bloody was deemed unparliamentary in 2010, so I'll just make a note of that. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the Premier's Chief of Staff met with the member, showed him a path back to Cabinet, and told him the first thing he needed to do was ensure that the trial was dealt with. I'll ask the Premier a simple question. Does he believe it's appropriate for a member of his staff to entice a member back to Cabinet on certain conditions related to an assault trial?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to tell the honourable member he is inaccurate, Mr. Speaker. If he looked at the sequence of events, Mr. Younger was given a leave of absence, Mr. Speaker, took leave of absence in early December. I told him when he returned to health to inform me that his health had returned and he would be put in the queue with all other members of our caucus come to the Executive Council. He was brought back into the Executive Council long before, Mr. Speaker, the criminal case was dealt with in the courts, Mr. Speaker. So the assertion that the honourable member suggested that the only way back was to eliminate that is absolutely false and inaccurate.
Just want to remind the Honourable Premier again to try and refrain from referring to the member opposite by his proper name. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier clearly has an issue with his Chief of Staff because he said, and we've already quoted, the first thing that has to happen is that the legal matter be dealt with. He actually invoked the Premier's name. The Premier wants the legal matter dealt with. Was the Chief of Staff speaking for the Premier when he said that or not?
No. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank again the honourable member for the question. I want to again go back to what has been the issue that has been before this House. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member was brought back into Cabinet before the criminal case was before the courts. What had happened, Mr. Speaker, he used an obscure law, Mr. Speaker, ruled in this House that he'd been given advice is often waived in criminal cases. Unbeknownst to us, Mr. Speaker, that was not communicated to us till after the case, the day after, Mr. Speaker, was on Thursday night. When we were informed of that, Mr. Speaker, we asked him to waive his client's list of privilege with the clerk of this House, which he did. Once we received the information, Mr. Speaker, we very clearly knew that the member from Dartmouth East had given us false information. We removed him from the Executive Council and caucus, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier seems to be hanging his hat on the fact that Mr. Young, or the member for Dartmouth East, went back to Cabinet in July. Mr. Speaker, the meeting with the member for Dartmouth East that the Premier's Chief of Staff attended was in February. And at that meeting, the Premier's Chief of Staff says, we anticipate that the trial will be tossed, Mr. Speaker. So I've got to ask the Premier, did the Premier's Chief of Staff tell the Premier he expected the trial to be tossed before he put the member back in Cabinet in July?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to tell the member opposite that he is referring to information that is part of a conversation that is completely inaccurate, if his version of this conversation that the member from Dartmouth East is telling this House and telling the media is accurate, Mr. Speaker, why would I have brought him back into the Executive Council in advance of that? It just doesn't make sense. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, why we're here, Mr. Speaker, is Mr. Younger was a victim of an assault. The member from Dartmouth East was a victim of an assault. That assault was before the courts. He used an obscure privilege in this House that many of us didn't even know existed, Mr. Speaker, and then he miscommunicated that to me. When we found out later that day, it was a reporter who found a letter that went before the court, presented by his lawyer, which contradicted what the member from Dartmouth East had told us. At the end of the day, we asked him to waive his client solicitor privilege to the clerk of this House, which he did, Mr. Speaker. I want to be clear. Mr. Younger is no longer in the Executive Council because he misrepresented the facts that he was provided by the clerk of this House, and I cannot, Mr. Speaker, in good conscience, have someone standing around the executive table and in my caucus who is not forthright with the facts.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that we have two different versions of events. The version that was recorded and released yesterday, with the words of the Chief of Staff of the Premier there for all to see. The Premier says that's only one half of the conversation. The version that the member for Dartmouth East had. Well, I'll ask the Premier, will he make his Chief of Staff available to media today so that the Chief of Staff can give his version?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure all members of this House the facts that have been presented to the public of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, have been based on what we have learned that have come from this court case that was tabled, Mr. Speaker. The fact that we discovered that Mr. Younger actually the member from Dartmouth East misrepresented what the clerk of this House had provided them for legal advice was, Mr. Speaker, enough information for me to remove him from the Executive Council and our caucus.
Just a reminder that QP will conclude at 10:54. The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've repeatedly asked the Premier if he knew about the meeting between his Chief of Staff and the member from Dartmouth East on the 12th of February, and whether or not he was briefed about what was discussed during that meeting. And the Premier so far will not respond to either one of those questions. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, if he didn't know about the meeting of February the 12th, shouldn't he have known?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind her what it's like to be in government, Mr. Speaker, what it's like to be the Premier of this province. I have a Chief of Staff who communicates regularly with members of the Executive Council, members of our caucus, on a day-to-day basis, in conversations that, Mr. Speaker, I would have no idea that are taking place. This is a $10 billion corporation, Mr. Speaker, that we are turning around and moving forward, and Nova Scotians are responding to the direction we're taking.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And so I want to ask the Premier very simply this question. Is he telling this House that he had no idea that a meeting between his Chief of Staff took place on the 12th of February and what was discussed in that meeting until the release of that tape yesterday?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to again remind the honourable member that the Chief of Staff in our government works with the members of the Executive Council and all members of our caucus. And I will remind the opposite member, unlike when they were in government, people who actually work in government today are allowed to do their job.
The Honourable Member for Hants East. Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. First of all, I'll thank the Minister. In recent sessions of this House, I've asked numerous questions with regards to short-term and interim plans for Highway 101 through a very dangerous stretch from Garland's Crossing to Falmouth. We now see and have seen for a number of months work going on there, and that's great. But today I would like to ask, and following up to that, can he advise us on what the long-term plan is and maybe how many years out we're looking at for further action to be taken?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, there have been some short-term improvements which the member has identified, embedded marking, some electronic signs, oversized signs, which really have helped in the short term. But the member is absolutely right. It is a very important corridor for us, heavy volumes, important for the mobility of our province from a safety perspective and, of course, from an economic one. As the member would know, that corridor is part of the feasibility study, which is ongoing now, which really is first of its kind, very significant to look at 8 key sections of the province and our provincial highway system, and that will ultimately look at what we need for the long-term solutions for that area. That particular section of the 101 is an important one. We'll have not only some details on what we're going to do, Mr. Speaker, but there will be some specifics on the design for that through this process, which will also include public consultation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister. I wonder if he could maybe be a little more clear on the time frame for that to be complete, if that is known at this point.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the feasibility studies finished in its entirety in April of 2016. The public consultations we hope will start this fall. If not, they'll be early in the new year. So at that point, we'll have an idea not only on the design and what the overall corridor will look like, but also there will be some specific costing associated with that. Then, of course, we'll look at the models for payment for those specific areas and what long-term improvements will take place. So by April 2016, we'll certainly have a good feel of where we're going with the 101 and many of the other key corridors here in the province of Nova Scotia. Thanks.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday it emerged that the Premier's Chief of Staff had sent a text message to the member for Dartmouth East after the trial was thrown out, and the text message said, "Good day today." Now, the Premier was asked about that, and he said that's not the whole message. Well, Mr. Speaker, the rest of the message said, "I suggest ignoring the media on this." Premier has asserted repeatedly that they've encouraged the member to say all he knows, to be available to answer all questions, and yet his Chief of Staff texted, "I suggest ignoring the media on this." I'll ask the Premier, why did his Chief of Staff send a text message to the member for Dartmouth East telling him to ignore the media on this important issue?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The member from Dartmouth East had communicated with my Director of Communications prior to that exchange. It was informed to him we needed to gather the facts, what this obscure ruling that he was using, Mr. Speaker, to move away from this criminal case. We had then went into the Department of Justice. By the time we received the message back from them, there was a message sent to Minister Younger informing him that there would be a press conference, the member of Dartmouth East was made available for him in the morning at 9 a.m., which this was at 7 p.m., the night before, at which time Mr. Younger sent a message back saying the member from Dartmouth East sent a message back saying he would like to speak to the Director of Communications and the Chief of Staff.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it appears the Premier knows a lot about the messages going back and forth between his Chief of Staff and the member for Dartmouth East. He said yesterday we're only hearing the messages that the member for Dartmouth East wants us to hear. Well, that can be cleared up quite easily, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier instruct his Chief of Staff to release all of his text messages or emails or other exchanges that he has had between himself as the Premier's Chief of Staff and the member for Dartmouth East and save all of the Freedom of Information requests that are inevitably going to follow?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. If you'd been paying attention, I communicated that timeline yesterday, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate the honourable member is now starting to act like the member from Dartmouth East and only providing this with certain bits and pieces of information.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, some things are becoming more clear. The Premier's office were unable to manage the outcome of the events that led to the loss of a cabinet minister and a member of caucus, even though clearly there was some attempt to prevent that. And it now appears the Premier is working hard to save his Chief of Staff, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, if we find it hard to believe that the Premier wasn't briefed in discussions with the member from Dartmouth East on the path back to to Cabinet. I want to ask the Premier, who makes decisions about who goes into the Cabinet? The Premier or his Chief of Staff?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for her question. There's nothing to brief me on, Mr. Speaker. I communicated to the honourable member from Dartmouth East, and when his health returned, Mr. Speaker, I'd put him in the queue with everyone else. Mr. Speaker, he informed me that his health was back. When I shuffled the Cabinet, he came back in. I want to remind this House, long before the criminal case was actually dealt with in the House, Mr. Speaker, no one else had to communicate that conversation to me. I had that conversation, Mr. Speaker, to tell the member when his health returned to let me know.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, when you had that conversation, were your three conditions that the court case be dealt with, hopefully tossed, that the member return to work and to this legislature, and that the member keep his mouth shut in terms of what occurred that led to the incident, the criminal charges?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to remind the honourable member that when in December, when the member from Dartmouth East was a victim of an assault, he had also received a number of death threats, Mr. Speaker. He had communicated to us he had health issues. Mr. Speaker, we at that time said to him, you need to take a break or we're going to provide you with one, Mr. Speaker. He chose to take that break, communicated that to Nova Scotians. I informed him at that time when his health returned that he would be put in the queue with all other members of the Executive Council, Mr. Speaker. He informed us when I shuffled the Cabinet. He came back in, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier seems to be hanging his hat again, this time on some theory that only part of these discussions and texts and emails have been released. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's an easy way to clear that up. Release all of them. The member for Dartmouth East was asked about this, and he said his BlackBerry and all his files were deleted, wiped, the night that he was dismissed from Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to ask the Premier, is that true? And if it's true, can those files be retrieved?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The member from Dartmouth East government BlackBerry, Mr. Speaker, was secured by the people who own it, Mr. Speaker, which is the government of the people of the province of Nova Scotia. His personal contacts, his calendar were sent back to him, Mr. Speaker. Going through the process now, seeing which one of those information pertain to government business. Those that pertain to government business will remain in the possession of the government, Mr. Speaker. He knows that full well. The rest of the contents will return to Mr. Younger.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's awfully hard to get a yes or no answer today on this important matter, but I'll try another one. Mr. Speaker, the Premier seems to know a lot about the entire meeting that his Chief of Staff had with the member for Dartmouth East. He knows it was 20 minutes long. He knows that only a part of it has been released. He was asked what was in the rest of it, and he gave us a summary of what he thought was in the rest of it. So I'll ask the Premier, has he heard the entire 20-minute conversation, and will he actually release it so we can clear this all up?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is only providing this House with, well, let me say he's providing this House, Mr. Speaker, with inaccurate information. At no time have I said I heard the rest of that conversation. What I said to him, that the Chief of Staff communicated to me that meeting was about that conversation about 20 minutes. What we provided here is about 2 minutes of the conversation. How would I be able to provide? I didn't tape the conversation, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whether or not someone sits at the Cabinet table, as the Premier has indicated, is a really important and it's a serious matter. And the vetting of people going into Cabinet should also be seen as a very serious matter. So, Mr. Speaker, we know that the Premier's Chief of Staff met with the member from Dartmouth East on February the 12th to talk about the path back into Cabinet. What we do not know is whether or not the Premier was aware of the conditions that were being laid out in that discussion. So I want to ask the Premier one more time, Were you aware of the 3 conditions that were outlined as the path back into the Cabinet?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I don't know where the honourable member is coming up with these conditions. I made it very clear in December that when the member from Dartmouth East returned to good health, he would be put in the queue with all other members. The assertion that she's making on other conditions just simply doesn't add up, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member was brought back into the Executive Council long before that court case was dealt with in the courts, Mr. Speaker. Her assertion just doesn't make sense.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker, is that the Premier is avoiding a fundamental question of what went on between his Chief of Staff and the member from Dartmouth East with respect to coming back into the Cabinet, and what the Premier knew about that. If he knew that that meeting was happening, and if he was briefed after it had occurred. It's a very, very simple question, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the version of that conversation, Mr. Speaker, they need to go talk to Mr. Younger. I have no idea what happened. Sorry, the member from Dartmouth East, Mr. Speaker. Let me be clear, though. I communicated to the member from Dartmouth East in December, Mr. Speaker, when we returned to good health, I would put him in the queue to come back into the Executive Council like all other members. I want to remind the members of this House, that moment in time, he was the victim, Mr. Speaker. Is the honourable member suggesting that I should be penalising someone who's a victim of an assault charge, Mr. Speaker? It absolutely goes against everything that Nova Scotians believe in.
The Honourable Leader. Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 117, the Public Inquiries Act?
We'll now have Bill number 117, the Public Inquiries Act. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I was expecting the Minister to speak, but I know that the Minister has already spoken on this matter in the spring, so just bear with me for a second.
She didn't speak.
Oh, order,
okay,
please.
I guess I
just need a second to The Honourable Minister of Justice. Sorry, the bill still needs to be